Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel, and I am joined today by Ray Grasse. Hello, Gray.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, I I couldn't resist a book that's entitled "So What Am I Doing Here Anyway?" Could I? What am I doing here anyway? The question that we all ask. And so I'm wondering, what prompted you to call your book that?
Well, I'm glad you asked that because it comes up from readers. It's actually twofold. It's a beveled edge. On the one hand, it refers to an essay in the book, which was an article from out in Astrologer a year or so ago, that takes a somewhat unorthodox view of locational astrology, where I live in Wheaton, Illinois, and I can't seem to get out of Wheaton, Illinois. It's a strange, it's like the what's the line in the Godfather movie? They keep pulling me back in. Uh, and then someone pointed out one day, they sent me a copy of the horoscope for the founding of Wheaton, Illinois. And the Jupiter in Gemini was conjuncting my natal sun in the ninth house. All of my publishing basically has been out of Wheaton. So there is, to cut to the chase, I have a real karmic connection or astrological connection to Wheaton as far as publishing and writing and teaching. A lot of my teaching has been through the Theosophical Society down the street. So I talk if you're looking, for example, if someone is thinking of moving to another state or another country even, you can look at how your chart works with astrocartography or local space astrology, like my old friend Steve Cozy talked about. But you also, I think, have to look at the horoscope of the city or the state or the country you're in. Like the woman that I knew that moved to America, hoping that she would improve her romantic prospects. And then the United States sun, I can't remember if it was exactly squaring or conjuncting her Venus. So things didn't quite work out the way that she thought by coming to America. But the other level of it is the final chapter in the book takes a more spiritual look at the question of why we are here from a broader perspective, an interpretation of the story in Genesis of the Garden of Eden. And it goes back to the old, I think it's from the Nag Hammadi. I can't believe I don't remember it, but the story of the hymn of the pearl, which is a great Gnostic, I believe it is, story. And what does all this mean in terms of why we are here? And what's the deeper meaning of this suffering, of this existence? So the title is twofold in that sense. It's very astrological on the one hand, but it's also more of an esoteric, occult, spiritual sort of perspective.
Yes, and in fact, both are very relevant, and I actually really like your style of writing as well. I find it very engaging, and it grabs your attention, and it's everything that you want in a book. It's that it engages you. So I just want to come back to what you said there about, yes, astrocartography, locational astrology being very important, very relevant, but checking the chart of the place in connection with your own, because I feel that to be very, very true. I look at the compatibility. And what are we looking at? Are we looking at the compatibility of different cultures with our own temperament, perhaps? But I feel the first time I ever landed at Gatwick Airport, I knew I was home. I hadn't left the airport. All I knew, I hadn't left the airport. All I knew was I was in England and this was home. So this is a very interesting thing, because then as I begin to learn about astrology, I discover that my North Node and the and the North Node for the 1801 chart, which we all use for this country, or most of us would use for this country, are the same. And I
Ah,
think, that's why I knew I was home.
yeah, yeah. Do you did you by any chance check the founding of the William the Conqueror chart of what's the year? I can't remember the 1066
1066.
chart,
Yeah,
December
the
25th or something.
1066 chart. Yeah, that didn't feel to have quite as much resonance. Um, but the 1801 chart certainly does. And, you know, there are so many elements of that chart that tie in with mine
Yeah,
that I thought, okay, this is why I'm here. This is why it feels right to me. And there have been many occasions on which the subject of emigrating has cropped up for one reason or another. And I just feel like I can't leave.
yeah,
This is where my roots are. This is where my roots were before I ever came here.
yeah.
so, so what you're saying feels very, very right to me.
That 1801 period is interesting because that was the second Pluto return for England. When it was like a rebirth. So in a sense, you're plugged into that new dispensation, you might say, more than the old one, perhaps, is one way to look at that.
Yes, and interesting you should say that because Pluto is conjunct my ascendant, so perhaps there's a
Oh,
resonance there. Um,
interesting.
so I think yes, it's very. So this is the type of stuff that you're playing with all through the book. Different thoughts, different ideas that you explore, and I think there were lots of things there that I different ideas that I thought, oh yeah, I've thought about that. I'm so glad you've written this. So the other one that caught my eye was the chapter, does the horoscope keep working after someone's death?
Yeah.
And I I think that's a very interesting question. Tell us how you began to think about this.
Yeah, it's actually back in the 80s. I studied for a while with Joseph Campbell, was a mythologist. He would come through Chicago every year, and I would go take weekend workshops with him. And then several years after that, he became very famous as a result of these interviews that Bill Moyer did with him on public television titled The Power of Myth. And I was intrigued because he had died at that point. So I said, what would show that in his chart? And I discovered that that series, that media explosion of interest in Joseph Campbell, which was also fueled by George Lucas because he had based so much of Star Wars on the hero myth and was friends with Joseph Campbell. I looked at his chart, and the key thing that was happening, this is, I think, around 1988, 89, was Joseph Campbell was going through his Uranus return. So I started looking at charts of people when, let's say, a person, a celebrity, or a historical figure died, whether it's Van Gogh or Napoleon or J. Edgar Hoover, and you would see movies or books come out, and there'd be a big splash about their life after they were dead, and it was always under some Pluto or Uranus aspect, or like JFK, the movie that Oliver Stone did, was, I think, on the Saturn return of, I think, of the assassination itself. So I'm not the first astrologer to talk about this. This is something that I think most astrologers have wondered about. I think I first read about it when Abraham Lincoln, someone had looked at his chart, and when his body had been stolen, I guess it was, out of the crypt in southern Illinois, and someone looked at the chart for when the body was relocated and then put back in the tomb. And there was, I guess it was aspects to his fourth house at the time when there was a lot of turmoil in his natal chart, even though he was dead. So this is something that has been in the air for quite some time amongst astrologers, though my personal feeling about it, I say in the chapter that I think that it, in a sense, it disproves the mechanistic theory of astrology. Because how could you say some secret rays are coming down from the planets to affect someone that isn't there anymore except in dust form? It's almost as though the legacy of the person lives on, which means that the way I call it is, it's like our personality is a meme in the cosmic mind. And that lives on. That just doesn't die when we die. And so the stars aren't acting on the physical person. We continue to move on in terms of our, how do you call it? The thought form of who I am, of who you are, is that doesn't perish. And there was something else about that I wanted to add. Oh, well, that was it. The idea that I think the only way to really explain that is that we are memes in the cosmic mind in some sense. And that's, of course, if you buy into the idealistic view, the idealism, the notion that this is all like a great dream, which is fundamental to my way of thinking. It's you can't really explain. You can, I think, explain certain parts of astrology in mechanistic terms. Solar flares have a tangible effect on us. The moon has certain effects on our, we're largely water. So yeah, I'm not saying there's no physical impact that the stars and the planets have on us, but then you have to deal with not only things like how does the chart continue to work after someone dies, but such things as Mercury retrograde. Mercury is moving backwards from the standpoint of our perspective on Earth. It's not rays. Are you going to say that maybe it's backward moving rays coming from the planet? It doesn't exist beyond the geocentric position of our place on Earth. So you can't explain that in conventional mechanistic terms. By the same token, how do you explain progressions? I don't mean you personally, but I mean, if you want to believe that astrology can be reduced to a mechanistic material basis, well, then you obviously can't use something like progressions. There's no rays coming from anywhere. It's a symbolic sort of analysis. Does that kind of answer what you're?
It does. And because I've played with this idea also, and I've been looking at it from the point of view of not the famous people that we all read about, but the average person who, let's just say, the scope for being noticed in the world is less. So what happens? And there it is, the transits that are linked with grandchildren being born, or events in the family that show up in the chart of the deceased person.
Yeah.
And I think that's really very interesting to me. I'm with you, in the way that you see it. And I think also we have to remember that the you were saying, the idealist, that this is all, the dream, the Mayan dream. But actually there's quite a lot in the newer fields of science that suggest that would be actually the case. And looking at things from an energy perspective, if we're looking at astrology and we're looking at it from a spiritual perspective, then we're thinking about it as an energy. And if it is, as many people believe, the case that we choose our time of birth, then that's an energy imprint that the soul is incarnating into. And so that's interesting in itself, because now we're looking at it from an energy perspective again, and we know the energy is not destroyed. So there is that. we also, those who study mediumship will know that the soul continues to have a relationship with the family, even if the family doesn't know that the soul is there. So you can go into spiritualist churches up and down this country and watch mediums working, and the number of times that you will hear somebody say, oh, there's a new child in the family, and you know how happy they are that the new child has arrived, etc. So it's like our issue is that we believe that the person has died, but the chart is telling us that actually there's more to it than the physical body, as you say, and the mechanistic side of it. But I think too, there's a little thought that's kind of playing in the back of my mind every time I think about this, and it's to do with composite charts. Again, symbolic, but a composite chart is looking at the energy, the dynamic of the couple.
The chemistry, yeah.
The chemistry. It's the energy of the couple, and it has a life of its own that's not the individuals.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, I guess maybe what I'm playing with is the idea that the chart is definitely about the energy of the person and the legacy of the person and what the person contributes to the world. And consequently, that also continues to live. And you did talk about that. You did talk about legacy, but I'm just thinking about it in, you know, in that link or similarity to the way that you would look at a composite chart.
Yeah. You know, I remember one of my early teachers, a profound occultist named Shelley Trimmer. I've written about him, and he was a student of Yogananda's and a great astrologer, an American born in Pennsylvania. But I remember him saying that, you know, when you look at the auras of two people, they come together, they get intimate, and let's say the aura of one is red, the other is blue, and I think the way he said it was, it winds up creating a purple, you know, aura between the two of them or something. It's that chemistry. There really is an actual kind of energetic chemistry that occurs. And I think that's also brings us back to the point about there's a chemistry that occurs between a person and a place, like a country. You know, why is it Arnold Schwarzenegger, I can't say the name very well, he comes from Austria to America and he just takes off? What is it about his connection to the chemistry? And it's not an isolated thing that's limited to him or to the US. It is something that, you know, our lives tie into the places we are, and there's a chemistry there that can be very powerful or very combustible. You know, like, for example, George Lucas, and I'm getting a little off the track of what you're saying, I'm sorry, but this comes to mind. I mentioned this in the book, I believe, about George Lucas. It was born on the Uranus return of the US, the second Uranus return in 1945, I think it was. And look at his life. He's plugged into the technology of the US in an extraordinary way, and also that futuristic aspect of, you know, science fiction and all that, but industrial light and magic, and his contribution in terms of you know, these special effects, etc. I mean, there's a chemistry between George Lucas and the U.S. that I don't think would be the same if he had moved to France or England, or maybe if there was some other similar energy there. But forgive me for getting off track there. But again, the chemistry thing, the dynamic just doesn't happen between two people. It also happens between two countries. You know, so there's that chemistry factor it's a very real sort of tangible thing sometimes.
It is tangible. It's, and yes, you're right, because and no, you didn't go off track. It's part of the same thing. We're looking at astrology. We're looking at the energy or the different components of the whole, perhaps, if some people might say. And that makes me think about your chapter on synchronicity as well. So you called it the Grand Unified Theory or Grand Unified Theory of Synchronicity. Tell us about that.
That's something I've been working on for about 40 years. And I've written about it before, but that chapter was my effort to finally kind of condense it into a single essay, where as a result, partly of getting into astrology in my early 20s, I really came to believe that synchronicity was a all-pervading sort of phenomena. Once you get it, and Carl Jung, I think, but Carl Jung, who devised the term synchronicity, I think he believed that secretly, but he said in his formal writings, the book he came out, he first published the ideas on synchronicity in 51 and 52. He basically limited it to, he called it a relatively rare phenomena, the true isolated dramatic coincidence. But when you get into astrology and you start getting into the theory of correspondences, which is the basis of most astrology, even though you don't hear much talk about it because it's considered kind of an old school theory, esoteric theory, at least I don't see it talked about at all. It's the basis of rulerships of all types. You can't do astrology really without correspondences and the notion of each planet, each sign, each house has a matrix of corresponding symbols. So that, let's say, for one person, Mars might manifest as, a fire in their house. For another person, it might be dropping a knife on their foot. For another person, it might be buying a red dress. There's all these different things that tie into correspondences. And if you really buy into that theory, which astrology presupposes, you have to rethink your whole notion of synchronicity. And so what I do in the chapter, I won't go into all the details, but I'm how can I say this simply? It's the isolated synchronicity is the tip of an iceberg. And so I use the old story, the fable of the 5 blind men and the elephant. Each person feels a different part of the elephant and thinks that's the whole elephant. Focusing on the rare isolated synchronicity is like just feeling the tail of the elephant. But what's the whole elephant? The whole elephant is that idealistic cosmology in which you see the universe as like a dream. Its very fabric is symbolism. In the same way that our dreams are symbolic, everything in the dream has a kind of a symbolic dimension to it. If you believe that this is a kind of a great dream, which even, philosophers like Schopenhauer talked about, there's a quote of his I think I use in the book, then these things are symbolic in a very great mind. I don't know whether, to use the word God or Allah or Plotinus to use the term the one, or big mind like some Buddhists talk about. It's this world seems to be a symbolic dream for something or someone in the same way that our own dreams are symbolic of our own psyches. And therefore, the isolated synchronicity is just the very most tip of the iceberg of this larger fabric. There's a great quote, great line, I should say, by William Irwin Thompson, who passed away a few years ago. He came up with this astonishing metaphor, which I steal all the time, which is a fly crawling across the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which is just one of the all-time great metaphors, because that, in a sense, summarizes our predicament. We're like flies on the Sistine Chapel. There's this mythic tableau spread out before us, and the fly doesn't realize there's this mythic story that it's engrossed in. And likewise, astrology helps us to understand that we are flies across our own Sistine Chapel in terms of this mythic tableau of the signs, the planets, and the houses. It's a mythic archetypal drama that we're caught up in. And astrology is one way to decode that and a way to help us, I think, gain a much broader understanding of synchronicity. Does that answer your question very well? I'm not
Yes,
objective.
yes, it does. And I think there's so much in what you said. And I sometimes think of synchronicity as peeking behind the curtain a bit, like the Wizard of Oz, where you
Yeah.
peek the curtain and you can see what's making it all run. Something, something when you have those synchronous moments, whether it's through the astrological lens or other means, I think you're getting a glimpse of something that is so awesome and so big. And then you blink and you go, oh, that's interesting. And 5 minutes later, you may be thinking about it, but you've moved on and you're doing something else. And then
Yeah.
boom, here comes another one.
Yeah.
And you think, ah, and I can go through phases where I have more than one synchronicity a day
Yeah.
for a number of weeks. And then it's kind of quiet. And then there's this flurry of synchronicities again. And I think many people would report that significant events in their lives involve synchronicity in some way.
Yeah.
So there is a lot, but this brings us to another one of your wonderful chapters, the issue of patterns and pattern seeking, where you get the skeptics who will say, oh, well, we're just predisposed to find patterns. What are your thoughts?
Well, again, well, not again, but uh, the skeptics often denounce things like astrology and certainly subjects like synchronicity regularly. I see it all the time. I follow the skeptical literature just so I know what the counter arguments are. I don't steer away from those things either about astrology or synchronicity. And our work as astrologers is almost always dismissed as, well, you're just, we're pattern seeking creatures, and therefore it's natural that you would think that you see a face in the clouds. They liken it very often to that phenomena of how someone might, see pareidolia as another, pareidolia, I think is the other term that's used for it, of seeing things that aren't really there. And yet, like I point out in the chapter, if we didn't have that pattern seeking ability, you would not have Isaac Newton or Albert Einstein or Copernicus, or Kepler. It's the pattern seeking function is what makes us great as human organisms in a way, because we can make sense of things and draw connections. Now that there's no question that can go overboard, where people can start. I also online see all sorts of conspiracy stuff that is so off the wall that I can see where that can go wrong so fast. But it also, as astrologer, Rick Tarnas made the point about how did he put this? That, well, astrology, the thing that makes it, I think, so valuable is it is replicable. It is testable. Now, the problem it has is because of the very thing we talked about before of correspondences. You can predict that under Uranus squaring Pluto that there's going to be upheaval, but you can't say exactly where it's going to be. You can't say exactly the specific form it's going to take, but you can certainly, like Rick said, astrology is archetypally predictive, not necessarily concretely predictive. And but if you understand the symbolic language, you see that the patterns that astrology brings up are astonishing in terms of how you can see things and they come to pass. Sometimes very precisely. The fact that the Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon precisely when Uranus conjuncted Jupiter. We just went through this Uranus-Jupiter aspect, and I've seen an uncanny number of synchronicities happening for people in the area where Uranus-Jupiter fell in their chart. So, for example, in your case, can I ask what house that Sun, Jupiter, Uranus thing took place for you?
Oh, but that's the ninth house.
Ninth. Oh, that is for me too. And so
Yeah.
I had an astonishing synchronicity happen involving publishing right around the time of the Uranus Jupiter. In fact, I just had one yesterday. I was interviewed yesterday by an astrology group in out east. I don't know what state it is, but on the East Coast. And like just literally a few minutes before, the lecture topic was the chapter in the book Simple Tips from a long-term astrologer, long-time astrologer. And just several minutes before that talk, Deborah Holding published the article on her SkyScript site. And I had been wondering for months, she had said months ago she was going to do that. And that came up right when I was doing this public talk on it. A lot of funny little synchronicities like that. And I think that Uranus and Jupiter have a lot to do with synchronicities. Uranus is the unusualness, the unexpectedness, the chance element of it. And Jupiter is the lucky start of it. Not all synchronicities are lucky. Some can be very unlucky and negative, but I have found throughout my life, I have a Jupiter-Uranus sextile in my natal chart. And I think it's one of the reasons I've been so fascinated by the subject. And you can almost see, actually, almost in any major aspect, if a person understands the symbolism, there are synchronicities that occur, I think, in connection with almost any major life change, whether that's a move or a job change or something like that. So that's one way to answer your question, I suppose.
Yeah, I think, you said that seeing patterns, people can get lost as well, because they're seeing patterns that seem very unlikely. And I look at that and I think, like you, I've taken the view, oh, that's taking things too far. But these days, more and more, I'm thinking, well, is it? Are they seeing something that I'm not seeing? What is this?
You see, to me, the key there is predictability. When you've had the experience over 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years of looking at stars and planets, and you see something coming up and it happens when you think it's going to happen. It may not be precisely the form you expect, but it's close enough that you know that there's not a coincidence in a superficial sense. And by the same token, I've been involved with, I wrote my first book, The Waking Dream, which dealt with the kind of the symbolic worldview in a general sense. And well, actually, it was in my second book where I talk about predicting things using symbols and omens. So for instance, like it was somewhere around 1985. I won't go into all the details right now, it's too involved. But I started seeing these omens that did not bode well for this shuttle that was going to be launched in late January of, I think it was 85. And thinking this is not looking good. And I wrote letters to several people, including my astrology teacher in Florida, Shelley Trimmer, and a friend of mine that worked at the University of Chicago. Let me turn this off here. I wrote letters saying, I don't have a good feeling about this launch of this shuttle blast off. And again, based on various omens and things that were coming up. And so when it exploded in midair, it was also one of the omens was the fact that the Voyager 2 spacecraft was getting our first close-up look at the planet Uranus that same weekend. And not just the planet Uranus, but the rings of Uranus. And it had to do with the rings of Uranus. And I felt there was going to be some kind of technological high-tech disaster happen around the time of the shuttle blast off. So anyway, the point is, getting back to the point you were raising, that when you see things and you make predictions, that it's not going to prove anything to a scientist necessarily or a hardcore skeptic, but it proves to yourself that you're not just spinning yarns in your mind. Because a lot of these things that I see online, these conspiracy theories or these very far out kind of metaphysical ideas and schemes and worldviews, they're totally untestable, whereas astrology is testable, after you do it enough.
Yes. I think it's a tricky one because, as you say, the law of correspondences, or it's a lot of it, I think, is also intuition. and instinct.
Yeah.
How is it that our ancestors made connections between certain plants and illnesses, and certain plants and organs that they had no ability to see, or the planets as well? I think some of this is intuition, and I think some of it is, it will take a while for that body of evidence to form and
Yeah.
develop. And I think that is the beauty of astrology, is that it is so many centuries old, that we do have a large body of human experience behind it. So I think, yes, I think that's very true. But I think there have been so many times when I have been dismissive of what I perceive to be a magical way of thinking,
Yeah.
because somebody thinks of something as an omen. And I think, oh, that doesn't seem very likely. Or, there's a whole set of a sequence of events, and I think, oh, they're reading too much into it. And lo and behold, it turns out to be correct. And I think, oh, I missed something. We don't. It's a mystery, isn't it? Because it seems so far-fetched. To what extent are we talking about a self-fulfilling prophecy? To what extent? You see, there's so many questions about how we perceive the world, how we understand it, and how much that understanding influences outcomes, that we can really tie ourselves in knots, can't we?
It's a slippery slope because, I've known a few people that got into the esoteric field and fell off the edge of the planet, so to speak, into the deep end. It can get very slippery when you talk about symbols and esoteric ideas and all this. And I think it's one of the reasons why not everybody is suited for the esoteric field. And you hear teachers talk about this a lot, that you have to be really grounded to get into something like astrology or esoteric or magic or symbolism, because it can so easily, go south. I want to get back to your point about the intuition. That reminded me of something, which is, yeah, the intuition. It's not just trial and error. There is something there where people have known things. And a good example of that was in the classical, well, I don't know how far back you can trace it, but one of the correspondences for Mars is iron. The color red, iron, as a metal, etc. So we go to the planet Mars and we find out that the reason it is red is because of the oxidized iron. Now, there's no way the old teachers could have known that logically through trial and error. And yet that was one of those things that turned out to be true. And you see that sort of thing quite a bit in the esoteric field, where some old belief is borne out by some modern finding of some sort. So I wanted to get back to that before I forgot that.
It's true. And there are times when I feel like, with the new perspectives that, as I say, these newer branches of physics, particularly quantum physics, quantum mechanics, are bringing in, that the world of the fairy tale that we were told was non-existent is actually closer to reality than what we might consider to be reality. So there's quite a lot to play with in terms of our understanding of the world. And that's why I so enjoyed your book. And just a reminder to everyone, what we are discussing is, so what am I doing here anyway? And here it is. An absolutely wonderful read. So I will be putting a link to this in the description box. Ray, if people want to find out more about your work, how do they do that?
My website is raygrasse.com, raygrasse.com. I also have a photography site, which is raygrassephotography.com. But if you go to Amazon or you just do a search, my book, this is my 9th book, and all the books are on Amazon and other sites if you look those up. And most of them are astrology, not all of them. A couple of them are, more about teachers I studied with and some autobiographical work. But the website is the best place to start to look more into that.
Ray, thank you so much. I'll be putting, as I say, a link to the book in the description box, as well as both of your websites. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
And thank you all for watching. Next time, we're going to be talking some more about Uranus. Until then, goodbye.